On the night of September 12th, 1844, 5 of Charleston, South Carolina's wealthiest and most prominent plantation owners left a private dinner party at the exclusive Charleston Club and were never seen again. Their disappearance was complete and absolute. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses came forward. No demands for ransom were ever made. The 5 men simply vanished from one of the most heavily patrolled and socially controlled cities in the antebellum South, disappearing so thoroughly that investigators could find no trace of what happened to them despite offering substantial rewards and conducting the most intensive manhunt in South Carolina history up to that point. What made the disappearance even more mysterious was that all 5 men had been heavily involved in suppressing a rumored slave rebellion planned for that exact night, and they had been meeting specifically to coordinate their response to intelligence about enslaved people planning a mass uprising. Within weeks of their disappearance, whispers began circulating in Charleston's enslaved community about justice being served, about powerful men learning that they were not untouchable, and about a night when the hunters became the hunted. But the truth of what really happened on September 12, 1844, would remain hidden for over 150 years, sealed in documents that were not discovered until the 1990s, when historians finally uncovered evidence of the most perfectly executed act of resistance in slavery's American history. Before we descend into this story of conspiracy, revenge, and the night that terrified Charleston's elite, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epic of Fear, where we uncover the stories that reveal how enslaved people fought back in ways that history tried to forget. Charleston in 1844 was the wealthiest city in the South, and one of the wealthiest in the entire United States, built on rice, cotton, and the labor of tens of thousands of enslaved people who outnumbered white residents by substantial margins. The city's elite lived in extraordinary luxury, with mansions along the Battery overlooking Charleston Harbor, summer homes in the cooler countryside, and social calendars filled with elaborate balls, dinners, and entertainments that displayed their wealth and reinforced their position at the top of South Carolina's rigid social hierarchy. But beneath this appearance of elegant security, Charleston's white population lived in constant fear of slave rebellion. The city had experienced several conspiracy scares and actual rebellion attempts throughout its history, including the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1822 that had resulted in the execution of 35 people and had traumatized white Charleston society with the revelation of how close enslaved people had come to organized uprising. By 1844, this fear had become embedded in the psychology of Charleston's elite, shaping everything from the city's architecture with its high walls and defensive features to its elaborate system of patrols, passes, and surveillance designed to control enslaved people's movements and prevent organizing. The white population was simultaneously convinced of their own superiority and terrified of the people they enslaved, and this contradiction created a society that was both immensely wealthy and profoundly unstable. The 5 men who disappeared on September 12th were among the most powerful figures in this society. Colonel William Rutledge owned 3 plantations, totaling over 5,000 acres and 312 enslaved people, making him one of the largest slaveholders in South Carolina. Judge Marcus Harrington presided over cases involving enslaved people and had a reputation for extreme severity, sentencing dozens of enslaved people to death over his career for crimes both real and imagined. Thomas Middleton was president of the Charleston Bank and controlled enormous financial resources that funded the slave economy. Dr. James Blackwood owned 2 plantations and served as the city's leading physician, treating wealthy white families while also conducting medical experiments on enslaved people without their consent. And Captain Richard Beaumont had made his fortune in the domestic slave trade, buying and selling thousands of enslaved people and separating families for profit over 3 decades. These 5 men were not just wealthy. They were the architects and enforcers of the system that kept slavery functioning in Charleston, and they were hated with an intensity that white people rarely understood or acknowledged by the enslaved people whose lives they controlled and destroyed. If anyone deserved to disappear, it was these 5 men, though no one in white Charleston society would ever admit this publicly. The events leading up to September 12th began in early August 1844, when white authorities in Charleston received information about a planned slave rebellion scheduled for mid-September. The source of this intelligence was never made entirely clear in official records, but it came through the network of informants that Charleston's elite maintained within the enslaved community, people who would report on fellow enslaved people in exchange for small privileges or out of fear of being implicated if rebellion plans were discovered. The intelligence suggested that enslaved people from multiple plantations were planning to rise up simultaneously, kill their owners, seize weapons, and either fight their way to freedom or die trying. The exact date of the planned uprising was given as September 13th, chosen because it fell during the rice harvest when enslaved people had more mobility and opportunity to communicate across plantations. The intelligence also indicated that the conspiracy involved dozens or possibly hundreds of people, and that it was being coordinated by individuals who had been planning for months. Charleston's elite responded to this information with their usual combination of fear and determination to crush any resistance before it could develop. Emergency meetings were held, patrols were increased. Enslaved people suspected of involvement were arrested and interrogated, often through torture, to extract names and details about the plot. And the 5 men who would later disappear took leading roles in organizing the response, treating the rebellion threat as a personal affront that required not just prevention, but severe punishment to ensure no one would dare attempt such resistance again. On September 10th, 2 days before the disappearances, Colonel Rutledge organized a meeting at his plantation outside Charleston, where the 5 men and several other wealthy slaveholders gathered to coordinate their final preparations. They reviewed intelligence about the rebellion, discussed which enslaved people to arrest preemptively, and planned how to make examples of the ringleaders once they were captured. The meeting's minutes, which survived in Rutledge's papers and were discovered by historians in the 1990s, reveal the mentality of men who viewed enslaved people's desire for freedom as criminal insanity that needed to be crushed with overwhelming violence. "We must demonstrate that rebellion means death," Judge Harrington stated during the meeting. "Not quick death, but prolonged suffering that will be remembered by every Negro who witnesses it." Dr. Blackwood suggested using convicted rebels for medical experiments before executing them, arguing that this would serve both punishment and science. Captain Beaumont recommended burning the bodies publicly as additional deterrent. These were not monsters from another planet, but rather ordinary men of their time and place whose participation in slavery had corrupted them so thoroughly that they could discuss torture and murder as casually as they might discuss agricultural techniques or business investments. The meeting concluded with an agreement that the 5 principal organizers would meet again on September 12th at the Charleston Club to review any final intelligence and ensure everything was ready for the mass arrests planned for September 13th. They left the plantation that evening, confident that they had the situation under control and that the planned rebellion would be prevented before it could begin. But what the 5 men did not know was that the rebellion intelligence was largely fabricated, planted deliberately by enslaved people who had learned that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemy was to make them think they had already won. The actual conspiracy was not a mass uprising planned for September 13th, but something far more targeted and surgical: the elimination of 5 specific men who were particularly hated and whose disappearance would both remove dangerous enemies and demonstrate that even the most powerful white men were vulnerable if enslaved people were smart enough and bold enough to strike at them. The intelligence about a mass rebellion had been carefully leaked through channels that white authorities would find credible, complete with just enough real names and details to seem authentic, designed to focus their attention on preventing a large-scale uprising while completely missing the actual plan that was being executed right under their noses. This misdirection was brilliant strategy, using white society's fear of slave rebellion to create the conditions that made it possible to strike at specific targets while authorities were looking in the wrong direction. The operations planners understood that Charleston's elite would not take seriously the possibility that enslaved people could plan and execute a sophisticated conspiracy, because their racist assumptions led them to believe that enslaved people were incapable of complex strategic thinking. This massive underestimation of enslaved people's capabilities would prove fatal for 5 men who walked into a trap without realizing they were being hunted. The dinner party on September 12th at the Charleston Club was attended by approximately 30 people, all prominent men who were part of Charleston's merchant and planting elite. The evening was meant to be a celebration of their success in preventing the rebellion and a demonstration of their unity and power. Expensive food and wine were served. Toasts were made to the preservation of order and the continuation of their way of life. Speeches were given congratulating the 5 principal organizers on their leadership in identifying and preparing to crush the rebellion threat. The atmosphere was one of confidence and satisfaction, wealthy men congratulating themselves on their cleverness and superiority. Around 11 p.m., the 5 principal organizers, Rutledge, Harrington, Middleton, Blackwood, and Beaumont, excused themselves from the party, explaining that they needed to make a final check on the security arrangements for the arrests planned for the next day. They left the Charleston Club together, walking out into the warm September night, and were seen by multiple witnesses getting into a carriage that was waiting on the street outside. The carriage pulled away heading north on Meeting Street, and the 5 men were never seen again by anyone who would admit to seeing them. What happened next has never been officially explained because authorities could not reconstruct the events with certainty. But the evidence that was discovered decades later suggests a carefully planned abduction carried out with precision that left no witnesses and no evidence that investigating authorities could find. The carriage that picked up the 5 men outside the Charleston Club was not the one they had ordered. Their driver, an enslaved man named Samuel, who worked for Colonel Rutledge, had been intercepted on his way to the club and had been replaced by someone else, who looked similar enough in the dark to not raise suspicion. The replacement driver took the 5 men not toward the security headquarters where they expected to go, but toward the docks on Charleston's waterfront. The men did not immediately notice that they were going the wrong direction because they were engaged in conversation and because Charleston at night was dark enough that landmarks were difficult to identify. By the time they realized they were not headed toward their intended destination, the carriage had reached a warehouse district where the streets were empty and where help would not be available even if they called for it. The carriage stopped in front of a warehouse, and the driver told the men that there was an urgent message waiting inside that required their immediate attention. This was plausible enough that the 5 men got out of the carriage and entered the warehouse, expecting to find messengers or officials with information about the rebellion plot. Instead, they found approximately 15 to 20 people waiting for them in the darkness, people who moved swiftly and silently to surround the 5 men before they could retreat or call for help. What happened next was violent and final, carefully planned to ensure that the 5 men were rendered unable to resist or escape, while leaving no evidence that would point back to the people responsible. The 5 men were bound, gagged, and carried deeper into the warehouse, where a boat was waiting at a private dock that connected to Charleston Harbor. Though possibly drugged with substances that would keep them docile and unable to fight effectively, the journey took approximately 30 minutes, moving south along the coast before entering a network of tidal creeks and marshes that characterized South Carolina's low country. The 5 men were removed from the boat, and what happened to them after that point ensured they would never be found, probably through drowning in the marsh, where their bodies would sink into the mud and be consumed by the ecosystem of crabs, fish, and bacteria that rapidly decomposed organic matter in the warm saltwater environment. But they may also have been weighted down and dropped into the deep channels where tidal currents would carry them out to sea, or where they would be buried permanently in mud and silt. Either way, the disposal was complete enough that despite intensive searching over the following weeks and months, no trace of the bodies was ever discovered. The disappearance was not noticed immediately because the other men at the Charleston Club dinner party assumed that the five had gone to the security headquarters and would return later, or had perhaps gone home separately. It was not until the next morning, September 13th, when the five men failed to appear for the planned arrests and their families reported them missing, that anyone realized something was wrong. The immediate assumption was that the planned slave rebellion had somehow started early, and that the five men had been killed as the first victims. Panic spread through White Charleston as people imagined that the rebellion they had feared was underway and that they all might be targets. Military units were mobilized. Hundreds of enslaved people were arrested on suspicion. Interrogations became torture sessions as authorities desperately tried to extract information about what had happened to the five men and whether a larger uprising was imminent. But no useful intelligence was obtained because the enslaved people who were arrested genuinely had no knowledge of any mass uprising, because there was no mass uprising to know about, and because the people who actually knew what had happened to the five men were not talking and could not be identified through the random arrests and interrogations that followed. As days passed without the rebellion materializing, and without any trace of the missing men being found, the panic gradually shifted to confusion, and then to a realization that something unprecedented had occurred that authorities could not explain or solve, despite having unlimited resources and power to investigate, and eventually expanded to involve authorities throughout South Carolina and neighboring states. An enormous sum in 1844 equivalent to over $1.5 million today. The marshes where the boat had gone were searched by organized groups, though the vastness of the terrain and the number of possible locations made comprehensive searching impossible. Neighboring states were alerted to watch for any sign of the missing men. No physical evidence that could be connected to any individual or group. These supernatural theories, while ridiculous, revealed how thoroughly the disappearance violated white society's understanding of what was supposed to be possible in a city where they controlled every aspect of life and where enslaved people were supposedly too closely monitored and too inherently incapable to execute such a sophisticated operation. The truth about what happened to the five men was preserved not in official records, but in oral histories, passed down through families of formerly enslaved people and in a few written accounts that were hidden during the slavery era and only discovered much later. The most detailed account came from a manuscript written by a man named Isaiah Turner, who had been enslaved in Charleston in 1844 and who later escaped to freedom in the North before the Civil War. Turner wrote his account in the 1870s after slavery had been abolished and when he felt safe enough to document what he knew, but he requested that it not be published during his lifetime because he feared retaliation against family members still living in South Carolina. The manuscript was passed down through his descendants and was eventually donated to a historical society in the 1990s when researchers were studying resistance to slavery. Turner's account confirmed that the disappearance was an organized operation planned and executed by enslaved people from multiple plantations, coordinated through the hidden communication networks that enslaved people maintained despite constant surveillance. According to Turner, the operation had been planned for over a year, with participants carefully vetted to ensure no informants were included, and with extensive rehearsal of every step to minimize risk of failure. The false intelligence about a mass rebellion had been leaked deliberately to focus white authorities' attention in the wrong direction, and specific individuals had been assigned roles in the abduction based on their skills and their ability to avoid suspicion. The operation involved approximately 25 people directly and many more who provided indirect support by creating alibis, spreading misinformation, and ensuring that no one talked afterward, even under torture. Turner's manuscript identified the leader of the operation as a man named Marcus, an enslaved carpenter who worked at the Charleston shipyards, and who had been planning some form of resistance for years after watching his wife and children sold away to different plantations. Marcus had recognized that direct rebellion was suicide, that any attempt at mass uprising would be crushed by white military power, but that targeted elimination of specific individuals might be possible if planned carefully enough. He had recruited carefully, approaching only people who had suffered specific injuries from the 5 target men, and who could be trusted absolutely to maintain secrecy. One of the participants was a woman named Rachel, whose daughter had been raped by Judge Harrington, and who had been powerless to protect her. Another was a man named Samuel, whose brother had been killed during medical experiments conducted by Dr. Blackwood. Others had lost family members to Captain Beaumont's slave trading, or had been brutalized by Colonel Rutledge's overseers. Each person involved had personal motivation for wanting these 5 men dead, and this shared desire for justice and revenge created bonds of trust that made the conspiracy possible. The planning had involved detailed reconnaissance of the Charleston Club, the streets around it, the warehouse district, and the marshes where the bodies would be disposed. Participants had practiced their roles, timing each step, identifying potential problems, and developing contingency plans. The operation had been conducted with military precision, and its success demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated planning and execution when properly motivated and organized. The aftermath of the disappearances was complex and contradictory. White Charleston society was traumatized by the incident, which challenged their fundamental assumptions about control and safety. If 5 of their most powerful men could simply vanish without trace, then no one was safe. The incident led to increased repression, with new laws restricting enslaved people's movements and new punishments for any behavior that might indicate resistance. Hundreds of enslaved people were sold out of Charleston in the months following the disappearances as owners became too frightened to keep them. The patrols were increased, the surveillance became more intensive, and the general atmosphere in Charleston became even more oppressive than it had been before. But paradoxically, the disappearances also had the opposite effect in some ways. The incident demonstrated to enslaved people that resistance was possible, that clever planning could defeat even the most powerful enemies, and that white people were not invincible despite their weapons and their control of legal and military power. The story of the disappearances spread through the enslaved community, not just in Charleston, but throughout South Carolina and beyond, becoming a legend of successful resistance that inspired hope and determination. The fact that no one had been caught, or even identified as suspects, made the story even more powerful, because it suggested that perfect resistance was possible if done carefully enough. For decades after, enslaved people would reference the night the 5 vanished as proof that justice could be achieved through intelligence and courage, even when direct confrontation was impossible. The 5 men were never officially declared dead for several years, because South Carolina law required extensive waiting periods before declaring someone dead without a body, and their families and business associates held out hope that they might somehow have survived and would return. But eventually, death certificates were issued, estates were settled, and life moved on without them. Their disappearances were officially classified as unsolved, with various theories recorded, ranging from abduction by abolitionists who took them north, to murder by escaped slaves, to the supernatural explanations that some people genuinely believed. The truth was known only to the people who had participated in the operation, and to those they trusted enough to tell, and this circle of knowledge remained small and carefully guarded. Even after slavery ended, and formerly enslaved people could speak more freely, most chose not to provide details about the disappearances, because some of the participants or their descendants were still alive and could face retaliation from white people who remained bitter about the incident. It was not until the discovery of Isaiah Turner's manuscript in the 1990s that historians had documentary evidence confirming what had long been suspected, that the Charleston Incident was not a mysterious disappearance, but a carefully planned execution carried out by enslaved people who had decided that these 5 men deserved to die and who were smart enough and brave enough to make it happen. The question of how to judge the actions of Marcus, Rachel, Samuel, and the others who participated in killing 5 men is complex and involves confronting difficult questions about violence, justice, and resistance under oppression. By modern legal and moral standards, what they did was murder, premeditated and carefully planned. But they were enslaved people with no legal recourse, no ability to seek justice through legitimate channels, and no hope of protecting themselves or their families through appeals to law or authority. The 5 men they killed were directly responsible for enormous suffering. Rutledge through his brutal management of plantations, Harrington through judicial murders disguised as legal sentences, Middleton through financing the slave trade, Blackwood through medical torture, and Beaumont through destroying families for profit. These men would never have faced consequences for their actions through any legal process because the law was designed to protect them and their interests. Violence was the only option available to enslaved people who wanted justice or revenge, and even that option required extraordinary courage and acceptance of risk because discovery meant torture and death. We can acknowledge that the killing of 5 people was wrong, while also recognizing that these particular 5 people had committed far greater wrongs that went unpunished, and that the enslaved people who killed them were acting in a context where violence was the only language that power understood. The legacy of the Charleston Incident extends beyond this specific case to broader questions about resistance too, knowing that such decisions often lead to harsh consequences, but also knowing that submission to injustice has its own costs. The people who participated in the Charleston Incident made a choice that some of them paid for with their lives, as several participants were eventually sold away to distant plantations or died under suspicious circumstances that may have been retaliation even though no connection to the incident could be proven. This legacy is uncomfortable for people who want simple moral categories where violence is always wrong and where resistance must be nonviolent to be legitimate. We can prefer nonviolent resistance while acknowledging that sometimes violence is the only option available, and that judging people who used violence to resist oppression requires understanding the context in which they made impossible choices. Modern commemoration of the Charleston Incident is minimal and contested, as with most incidents of violent resistance to slavery. There is no monument to Marcus and the others who participated, no historical marker explaining what really happened on September 12, 1844, and no public recognition of the incident, beyond occasional mentions in scholarly works about slavery and resistance. This erasure is deliberate, reflecting ongoing discomfort with celebrating or even acknowledging violence committed by enslaved people against slaveholders, even when that violence was provoked by far greater violence committed by the slaveholders themselves. Some historians and activists argue that the Charleston Incident deserves recognition as an example of brilliant strategic resistance that achieved its objectives without harming innocent people, and that demonstrated capabilities that racist ideology claimed enslaved people did not possess. Others argue that celebrating political violence, even historical violence committed in response to oppression, is dangerous and could encourage modern violence in response to injustice. These debates will likely continue without clear resolution because they involve fundamental questions about violence, justice, and resistance that every society struggles with, and that do not admit easy answers. What should we remember about the Charleston Incident, and what lessons does it hold for understanding slavery and resistance? First, that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents who made choices and took actions to fight against their oppression when opportunities arose or when circumstances became unbearable. Second, that resistance took many forms, from subtle everyday resistance to organized rebellion to the surgical elimination of specific enemies, and that all these forms required courage and strategic thinking that racist assumptions claimed enslaved people could not possess. Third, that white society's fear of slave rebellion was at least partially self-fulfilling because the brutality of slavery created genuine grievances that justified resistance and because the constant surveillance and punishment designed to prevent resistance created conditions where careful planning and perfect secrecy became necessary for survival. Fourth, that violence in response to oppression should be understood in context rather than judged by abstract moral standards that ignore the realities of power imbalances and the unavailability of peaceful alternatives. Fifth, that perfect crimes are possible when oppressed people are underestimated by those who oppress them, because contempt breeds carelessness, and because assuming that certain people are incapable of sophisticated action makes you vulnerable to exactly that kind of action. The Charleston Incident succeeded precisely because white society's racist assumptions prevented them from taking seriously the possibility that enslaved people could plan and execute such an operation. And this lesson applies broadly to any situation where powerful groups underestimate those they oppress. Remember the Charleston Incident. Remember the night of September 12, 1844, when 5 of South Carolina's most powerful men vanished completely, executed by people they had oppressed, and then disposed of so thoroughly that no trace was ever found. Remember Marcus, who planned the operation with military precision. Remember Rachel, whose daughter's rape motivated her participation. Remember Samuel, whose brother died in medical experiments. Remember the approximately 25 people who participated directly and the many more who supported them through silence and misdirection. Remember that they succeeded completely, removing their enemies and demonstrating that even the most powerful people were vulnerable when facing determined resistance. Remember also the 5 men who disappeared: Rutledge, Harrington, Middleton, Blackwood, and Beaumont, not as innocent victims, but as architects of suffering who ultimately faced consequences for their cruelty, even though those consequences came from outside legal channels. Their disappearances remind us that systems of oppression contain their own vulnerabilities, that power is never as absolute as those who possess it believe, and that eventually cruelty creates enemies capable of and willing to strike back regardless of cost. What do you think about the Charleston Incident and the actions of the enslaved people who planned and executed it? Was killing 5 slaveholders justified given the context of slavery and the absence of any legal means to seek justice? Should we celebrate sophisticated resistance that succeeded through intelligence and planning, or should we be troubled by the violence involved, regardless of provocation? How do we balance recognition of enslaved people's agency and capabilities with acknowledgement that they were forced into impossible situations where all choices involved moral compromise? And what lessons from the Charleston Incident remain relevant today about resistance to oppression, strategic action against powerful enemies, and the relationship between violence and justice? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story challenged you to think about the complexities of resistance, violence, and justice under oppression, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We explore historical stories that defy simple moral categorization and that reveal how people fought against injustice using methods that were shaped by their circumstances and constraints. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that oppressed people throughout history have always fought back when they could, sometimes through means that make us uncomfortable, but that were the only options available in impossible situations. Remember the Charleston Incident. Remember the perfect crime that was never solved. And remember that enslaved people's intelligence and capability were always far greater than their oppressors recognized. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that all resistance deserves to be remembered, even the resistance that required violence, because understanding how people fought against oppression is essential for understanding both history and humanity. Remember Charleston, September 12, 1844. Remember the night 5 men vanished. Remember justice, even imperfect justice, even violent justice, because sometimes that was the only justice possible.